July 17, 1944. Normandy, France. The fields were burning again. Smoke rolled across the hedgerows, thick and bitter, mixing with the scent of oil and gunpowder. German tank commander Oberleutnant Karl Brenner raised his binoculars, searching for movement through the haze. He had seen Shermans burn before, hundreds of them, bright orange torches that lit up the sky whenever a Panzer's 75mm shell found its mark. But this morning, something was different. He spotted 3 American Shermans crawling across an open slope near. His gunner took aim, fired, and the shell slammed directly into the lead tank. A perfect hit. But instead of erupting in flames, the tank simply stopped, smoke rising from the impact hole. And then, astonishingly, its turret turned. The gun fired back. The Americans weren't supposed to survive a hit like that. Brenner frowned. Reload, he barked. The second shell hit squarely on the side armor. Again, no explosion, no blazing inferno. The Sherman's engine roared as it backed into cover. Through his scope, Brenner saw crew members moving inside, still alive. Impossible, he muttered. For years, German crews had called the Sherman the Tommy Cooker, a tank that burned as easily as a stove. But now, something had changed. What Brenner didn't know, what almost no one on the German side knew, was that these new Shermans carried a secret. Inside their hulls, surrounding their ammunition racks, was a strange-looking system of steel boxes filled with water and antifreeze. It was called Wet-Stowage, and it was about to rewrite the rules of tank warfare. Just months earlier, in 1943, reports had reached the Pentagon that Sherman crews were dying not from direct hits, but from fire. When an armor-piercing shell penetrated the hull, it ignited the ammunition stored around the fighting compartment. The result was catastrophic. Flames engulfed the interior in seconds, and the tank became a coffin. Survivors were rare. Colonel Gladian Barnes and the engineers at the Ordnance Department began searching for a solution. They realized that the danger didn't come from the armor itself. It came from how the ammunition was stored. Shells were packed dry, with nothing to protect them from heat or sparks. The idea that changed everything came from a simple principle. What if you could stop the fire before it started? Tests began at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds. Engineers lined ammunition racks with small containers filled with water and a rust inhibitor chemical. When a shell hit the tank, the water would burst around the rounds, instantly cooling them and suffocating any sparks. They called it Wet-Stowage. It sounded almost too simple. But when tested, the results were undeniable. A 75% reduction in fires after hits. The first tanks with Wet-Stowage entered combat in the spring of 1944. Just weeks before D-Day. Looked the same on the outside, but inside they were quietly revolutionary. For the crews who fought in them, it meant the difference between death and survival. Sergeant William Red Carson, a Sherman gunner from the 3rd Armored Division, remembered his first encounter with the system. His tank had been hit twice during the push through Normandy. We felt the impact, smelled the smoke, thought it was over, he recalled years later. But nothing caught fire. We put out the smoke, fixed the breach, and kept fighting. Before that, we'd have been dead men. As American forces pushed through France, German tankers began noticing the change. Reports filtered up through panzer divisions. Shermans taking direct hits without catching fire. Some assumed the Allies were using better fuel. Others believed it was luck. But German intelligence soon learned of the truth. The Americans had quietly armored their ammunition with water. On the battlefield, it meant the Sherman could stay in the fight longer. German gunners, used to seeing their targets erupt, began to hesitate. We would hit them once, twice, and they would still be moving. One German Panzer gunner wrote in his diary. It was as if they refused to die. In the hedgerows of Normandy, where ambushes decided who lived and who burned. This small innovation became a game changer. A tank that didn't explode meant a crew that could continue firing and return the favor. By August 1944, more than 2,000 Shermans with Wet-Stowage were rolling across France. The change wasn't dramatic on paper, just a few hundred pounds added to the tank's weight. But in practice, it transformed morale. Crews stopped calling their machines death traps. They began to trust them. Corporal James Duffy, of the 2nd Armored Division, wrote home to his wife, They said the new tanks don't blow like candles, and they're right. We got hit yesterday. Scared the hell out of us, but it just smoked. We fixed it and rolled on. The Germans, meanwhile, were struggling with their own mechanical nightmares. The mighty Panther and Tiger tanks were engineering marvels, but complex and temperamental. Their engines overheated, their transmissions broke, and their armor, though thick, couldn't save them from constant Allied bombardment. The Sherman, on the other hand, could be repaired in hours. And now, with Wet-Stowage, it could survive hits that once meant certain death. During the breakout from St. Lake, one Sherman from the 4th Armored Division took 3 direct hits from an 88mm gun and stayed operational long enough to destroy the German position. When the battle ended, the crew climbed out, shaken but alive. The interior was scorched black, the ammo racks dented, but none of the shells had exploded. Wet-Stowage had done its job perfectly. It wasn't glamorous. There were no dramatic new weapons, no fancy armor plates, but it was pure American ingenuity. German engineers chased perfection. The Americans focused on survivability. By September 1944, SEAPTURED, German officers were filing detailed reports about the new Sherman behavior. Enemy tanks resist internal combustion after penetration. One report from Panzer Division noted, crew often survive multiple hits. Morale impact significant. It wasn't just about morale. The survival of crews meant experience. The same gunners and drivers could keep fighting, getting better with every battle. By contrast, German replacements were younger, less trained, and increasingly fearful. A veteran American tank crew inside a Wet Sherman was now one of the deadliest assets on the field. Winter came to France, and the tanks kept rolling east. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, Shermans faced off against the feared Tiger I and Panther tanks once again. This time, when the German shells struck, they did not ignite the American tanks like before. The snow hissed with steam as the wet racks absorbed the heat. The Americans fought back with fury, catching the Panzers in crossfire. Sergeant Carson, who had survived Normandy, now found himself outside his tank took another hit, this time from a high-velocity 88mm gun. The impact threw him against the turret. The smell of smoke filled the cabin. His loader panicked, shouting, "We're burning." But then they realized the fire had already died out. The water had saved them again. It was like the tank breathed, Carson said later. One second, we're dead. The next, we're still alive. The Germans could not understand why their 188s were losing their psychological edge. They had built their reputation on fear. One shot, one burning wreck. But now, the Shermans kept coming. Some Panzer's crews even began firing extra rounds into knocked-out Shermans just to make sure they stayed down. By early 1945, the secret of the Wet-Stowage system was widely known. But by then, it was too late. To counter, Germany's fuel reserves were nearly gone. Its factories bombed, and its once great Panzer divisions reduced to skeletons. The American Sherman, once mocked as inferior, had outlasted its enemies through sheer reliability and smart design. In total, nearly 49,000 Sherman tanks were built, and by the end of the war, more than half carried the Wet-Stowage system. Statistically, crews in those tanks were 4 times more likely to survive a direct hit than in earlier models. For the men inside, those odds meant everything. After the war, captured German commanders were interviewed about their impressions of the Sherman. Many admitted their surprise. One Panzer colonel said, "We never expected the Americans to solve their fire problem. When the Sherman stopped burning, we know the war had turned." 2 Historians. The Wet-Stowage system became a perfect symbol of American wartime philosophy. Simple, effective, and focused on saving lives rather than chasing perfection. Today, surviving Sherman tanks with Wet-Stowage systems can still be found in museums and private collections. Open one up, and you'll find the small metal containers around the ammo racks. Unremarkable to look at, but revolutionary in purpose. For the soldiers who fought inside them, it was more than a technical improvement. It was a promise that someone, somewhere, cared enough to give them a fighting chance. Back in Normandy, the burnt fields of July 17th are quiet now. Grass grows where tanks once burned, and the air smells of earth instead of smoke. But if you stand there long enough, you might still imagine the echo of engines, the roar of guns, and the disbelief of German crews watching their shells fail to ignite their enemies. They called it luck. The Americans called it innovation. Either way, it changed the outcome of the war.